James Walker was a man of simplicity, yet his name carried the weight of immense wealth and influence. At just over 60 years old, he had built his fortune from the ground up, turning a small tech startup into a billion-dollar empire. Despite his success, James was known for his humility, rarely showing off his wealth or extravagant lifestyle. He dressed in unassuming clothes, drove a modest car, and lived in a spacious yet understated home. His approach to life had always been one of quiet contemplation and a genuine desire to enjoy the simple pleasures. Traveling was one of those pleasures. Whenever James needed to fly, he would always opt for first class, not for the prestige, but for the comfort it provided. The extra space, privacy, and better service allowed him to relax and focus on his work. He enjoyed the peace of not being recognized or disturbed, and over the years, he had become a regular on flights from New York to Los Angeles. The flight attendants knew him as a quiet, polite man who kept to himself, never drawing attention to his status or his business. One fateful day, as James boarded his usual flight from New York to Los Angeles, no one aboard realized who he was. His face was familiar to those who worked for the airline, but his name wasn't one that immediately stood out. What none of the passengers knew was that James had recently acquired the very airline they were flying with, making him the new owner. Yet, for James, this was a quiet affair. He didn't feel the need to advertise this newfound power. Instead, he continued with his routine, blending in with the crowd, as if nothing had changed. As the plane took off, James settled into his seat, preparing for the calm flight ahead. But little did he know, this would be the journey where everything would change. Elizabeth Green had worked as a flight attendant for over a decade. She was confident in her role and had a clear idea of who should be in first class and who shouldn't. To her, first class was reserved for a certain type of passenger. The kind of person who wore expensive suits, was well-groomed, and carried themselves with an air of superiority. She had seen many passengers like this over the years, but there was something about James Walker that caught her attention. He didn't fit her mental image of a typical first-class traveler. James walked down the aisle, his attire simple but well put together, a navy blue blazer, a crisp white shirt, and dark trousers. His face was calm, not drawing any undue attention, and he carried no flashy accessories. As he approached his seat, Elizabeth quickly scanned him and instantly assumed that he had made a mistake. He didn't look like someone who belonged in first class. When James reached his seat, Elizabeth, with a stern expression, approached him. "Excuse me, sir," she said curtly, her voice carrying an air of authority. "I believe you're in the wrong cabin. This is first class. Your ticket should be in coach." James was taken aback by her assumption. He was used to the comfort of first class, and his ticket clearly indicated this was his seat. "I believe you are mistaken," he replied, his voice calm and measured, showing no sign of irritation. He handed her his ticket to confirm the seating assignment. Elizabeth took the ticket and examined it closely. Instead of apologizing or recognizing her mistake, she looked at it with suspicion, as if searching for an error. She muttered under her breath, not yet convinced. "This doesn't seem right." James stood still, his patience beginning to wear thin. The passengers around them had begun to notice the interaction, some watching with curiosity, others with quiet discomfort. But James remained composed, unwilling to escalate the situation. He didn't want to make a scene, and he certainly didn't want to create a fuss over something so trivial. However, it was becoming increasingly clear that Elizabeth's behavior wasn't just a simple mistake. It was driven by something deeper, something more ingrained. Elizabeth finally handed him back the ticket with a dismissive gesture. "Fine," she said curtly, "but don't let me catch you in the wrong cabin again." She turned and walked away, leaving James to sit in silence, pondering the encounter. He knew something wasn't right, but he had decided not to let it bother him. After all, this was just one flight. He would get through it, as he always did. But as the flight continued, it became apparent that Elizabeth's attitude toward him wasn't just a one-time incident. James sat back in his seat, the flight moving steadily through the skies, but his mind wasn't entirely at ease. He could feel the tension in the air, especially after Elizabeth's behavior. It wasn't just her dismissal of him as a first-class passenger. It was the underlying assumption, the judgment, the sense that she believed he didn't belong in the space he was occupying. And yet, He said nothing, choosing instead to focus on the task at hand, opening his laptop to review some important documents for his company. As the flight progressed, it became increasingly clear that Elizabeth's treatment of James was not a mistake, but a pattern. Every time she passed by, she seemed to ignore him, making no effort to offer him a drink or ask if he needed anything. The other passengers were being served first, and James was left to watch as the flight attendants moved around him, attending to everyone except him. Her subtle disdain was palpable, but James refused to let it disrupt his day. The tension grew. Elizabeth's snide glances toward James became more frequent. Every now and then, their eyes would meet, and he could see the judgment in her gaze, as if she were silently accusing him of something. He couldn't help but wonder, was it simply because he didn't fit her image of a wealthy first-class passenger? Was she making assumptions based on his appearance? Despite the growing frustration, James maintained his composure. He had been in far worse situations throughout his career, and he knew that reacting in anger or frustration wouldn't help. Instead, he took a deep breath and reminded himself that patience would be his ally. He had been successful by keeping calm under pressure, and this was no different. It would pass, he told himself. It would all pass. However, deep down, James knew that the moment for patience was running out. This wasn't just a personal slight anymore. It was a reflection of a deeper issue, one that needed to be addressed. But how could he go about it without creating a scene? He would wait for the right moment, he decided. A moment that would change everything. And that moment came sooner than he had expected. As the flight continued, Elizabeth's treatment of James became more apparent and increasingly overt. The subtle disdain had now transformed into open neglect. When the meal service began, Elizabeth moved swiftly down the aisle, serving drinks and snacks to the other first-class passengers. But when she reached James, she simply skipped over him without a second glance. James observed her carefully, noticing the deliberate manner in which she avoided acknowledging him, as if he weren't even there. The other passengers around James began to notice as well. Some exchanged glances, uneasy at the clear preferential treatment being shown to everyone else, while James was deliberately ignored. One elderly man sitting across the aisle from James finally spoke up, asking if James had been forgotten. Elizabeth's response was sharp and curt. "No, sir, everything is fine. He's just not ready yet." James had to restrain himself from speaking out, as the situation was beginning to feel more like a personal vendetta than an innocent mistake. Elizabeth was being visibly rude, but he couldn't help but wonder if her behavior stemmed from something more than just personal judgment, perhaps from a deeper bias that had nothing to do with him. She didn't even offer him a drink after the meal service had concluded. The way she moved about the cabin, serving everyone else with a forced smile, was in stark contrast to the coldness she showed him. This wasn't just a flight attendant doing her job. This was an act of deliberate exclusion, and James was starting to feel the weight of it more than ever. Despite the growing sense of discomfort and indignity, James didn't react. He remained calm, sitting back in his seat, his eyes scanning the horizon outside the window. But inside, his mind was working furiously. This wasn't something he could let slide. The mistreatment was far beyond simple disrespect. It was a pattern of prejudice that went unchecked. It was as if Elizabeth believed that people like James had no right to enjoy the same privileges as those who fit her perception of a first-class passenger. The more James thought about it, the more determined he became to set things right. This wasn't just about one flight or one passenger. It was about a larger issue that needed to be confronted. And for the first time, James decided he would act. He wouldn't let this small incident go unnoticed. Halfway through the flight, while the sun set and cast a golden glow across the plane's interior, James received a notification on his phone that would change everything. It was an email from his legal team, confirming that the acquisition of the airline had officially gone through. James now owned the airline, and his ownership was immediate and absolute. He wasn't just a passenger anymore. He was the one in charge. At that very moment, a sense of clarity washed over James. All of the frustration and discomfort he had felt on the flight, the dismissive attitude, the unfair treatment, suddenly felt less like an isolated incident and more like an example of a much larger issue. He was no longer just a person suffering from prejudice. He was the owner of the airline. He now had the power to do something about it. The flight had become his battleground, not just in the literal sense, but for the larger fight against inequality. James sat back in his seat, the weight of his new reality sinking in. The transformation was staggering. He could no longer allow such behavior to go unaddressed. He was no longer the quiet, unassuming billionaire he once was. He was in a position to effect real change, and this flight, with all its discomfort and mistreatment, would serve as the catalyst for what was to come. As the plane sailed through the sky, James pulled out his phone again, composing a message to his corporate team. He would not wait until the plane landed. The moment to take action was now. The internal investigation into the airline's culture needed to begin immediately. He wasn't going to let something as blatant as what had just transpired go unchecked. His power, he realized, wasn't just about wealth or control. It was about making sure that everyone, regardless of their race, background, or status, was treated with fairness and respect. His next move would be swift. It was time to right the wrongs that had taken place on his airline, starting with the person who had shown him the most blatant disrespect. As the flight continued, James's resolve strengthened. He knew that, although this one instance with Elizabeth was a glaring example, it was likely not an isolated case. Discrimination, subtle or overt, often permeated company cultures, and it was time to uncover just how deeply it had taken root within his new airline. James wasted no time. As soon as he landed, he instructed his senior leadership team to initiate an internal investigation. Over the next few days, video footage was reviewed, along with interviews from passengers who had experienced similar treatment during their flights. James watched the footage closely, his eyes narrowing as he saw patterns emerge. Flight attendants, including Elizabeth, were caught on camera treating certain passengers with subtle but clear disregard. People of color, in particular, were singled out, given less attention, and sometimes even ignored altogether. It became painfully evident that this behavior wasn't just a personal issue for Elizabeth. It was a broader cultural issue embedded within the airline's staff. Passengers who had been discriminated against during previous flights came forward, sharing their stories. Some spoke of being treated like second-class citizens, while others described experiences of being blatantly ignored or belittled. The testimonies painted a disturbing picture of an airline culture that had allowed such behavior to go unnoticed and unchecked for far too long. James was appalled, but not surprised. He had always known that such biases existed in the world, but to see them playing out so blatantly within his own company was a painful revelation. This wasn't just a problem to be addressed with one flight attendant. It was an entire system that needed to change. But James was not a man to simply accept things as they were. He understood that real change would require a systemic overhaul, and he was prepared to take bold action to make that happen. The investigation had revealed the issue. Now it was time to fix it, starting from the top and working its way down. This wouldn't be an easy task, but James was determined to make sure his airline would become a beacon of fairness, respect, and inclusivity, starting with the woman who had sparked this entire chain of events. James sat at his desk in his sleek new office, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his shoulders. The investigation had revealed much more than he had anticipated, far more than he had hoped. The evidence was clear. The discrimination wasn't isolated to a single incident, but part of a much larger issue that had festered within the company. The question now was how to address it. What was the most effective way to deal with someone like Elizabeth, who had so blatantly ignored her duties and treated a passenger with such disrespect? He knew he could easily fire her, swiftly and decisively. But James didn't want to simply punish her. This wasn't about revenge or retaliation. It was about using her actions to spark a larger, more meaningful change within the company. His decision was clear. He wouldn't fire Elizabeth outright. Instead, he would use the situation as a catalyst for transformation, both for her and for the entire airline. James called for an emergency meeting with his senior leadership team and key members of the HR department. Together, they crafted a plan that would address the issues at hand head-on. The airline needed to implement a zero-tolerance policy toward discrimination in any form. Every employee would have to undergo mandatory diversity and inclusion training. But more importantly, there would be consequences for those who failed to follow the new standards. No longer would the company tolerate the kind of behavior Elizabeth had displayed. The moment of confrontation came just a few days later. Elizabeth was called into James's office, along with a representative from HR. As she entered, she was visibly nervous, unsure of what was about to happen. Her usual confident demeanor had disappeared, replaced by an anxious uncertainty. James looked at her calmly, his voice even but firm. "Elizabeth," he began, "I've reviewed the footage and spoken to several passengers who've had issues with the way they've been treated on our flights. I'm afraid to say that you've been part of a troubling pattern." Elizabeth's face turned pale. She had known something was coming, but hearing the words out loud made the reality of her actions sink in. She had hoped it wouldn't come to this, that she could get away with the way she had treated people, especially passengers like James. "You've treated our passengers unfairly," James continued, his tone still controlled but carrying an undeniable authority. "And it's not just a one-time mistake. This kind of behavior has no place in this company. But instead of firing you immediately, I want to give you a chance to change. I believe people can grow, but that growth starts with acknowledging the truth. You'll be required to attend mandatory training, and I expect you to take it seriously. If you don't, there will be consequences." Elizabeth stood there, her eyes downcast, unsure of what to say. She hadn't expected a chance for redemption. She had thought her career was over the moment she realized James had caught wind of her actions. But now she had a choice: to continue down the path of prejudice or to embrace the opportunity for growth and change. "I understand," she said quietly, "and I will do everything I can to change." James nodded. "This is your chance to make things right. Not just for you, but for everyone at this airline. If you truly want to change, you'll have to show it, not just through words, but through actions." As Elizabeth left the office, she realized that her world was shifting. She didn't know how, but something deep inside her had been shaken. For the first time, she began to understand the gravity of her actions and how they affected not just the passengers, but the culture of the company as a whole. The following weeks were a period of intense reflection for Elizabeth. She attended the mandatory diversity and inclusion training, but it wasn't just a box to check off for her. For the first time in her life, she was forced to confront her own biases, something she had long denied existed within herself. The training was comprehensive, covering everything from unconscious bias to systemic racism and the impact of microaggressions in the workplace. At first, Elizabeth was defensive. She didn't want to believe that she, a woman who prided herself on her professionalism, had harbored prejudices. But as the training continued, the walls she had built around her beliefs began to crumble. She started to understand that her assumptions about people, her judgments about who deserved to be in first class, were rooted in deeply ingrained stereotypes that had nothing to do with the worth of the passengers she served. The most difficult part of the training was when they discussed the concept of privilege and the ways it had influenced her behavior. Elizabeth, who had grown up in a middle-class neighborhood and worked hard to get where she was, had never considered that her position as a flight attendant, her access to certain privileges, could have been influenced by her race, her socioeconomic background, and her own unconscious biases. It was a harsh truth, but one that she knew she needed to confront. As the weeks passed, Elizabeth began to change. She became more open-minded, more willing to listen, and more conscious of how her actions affected those around her. It wasn't easy, and there were times when she stumbled, but she committed herself to becoming a better person, both for herself and for the passengers she served. Her colleagues noticed the shift in her attitude, and slowly, she gained their respect. In a team meeting, Elizabeth stood up and shared her experience with the rest of the flight crew. "I've learned a lot about myself," she began, her voice shaky at first, but gaining strength as she spoke. "I didn't realize how much I was letting my biases affect the way I treated people. I've made mistakes, but I'm here to own up to them and do better. I hope you'll all hold me accountable." The room was silent for a moment, but then one of her colleagues spoke up. We all make mistakes. What matters is that you're trying to change, and that's what counts. Elizabeth smiled, a sense of relief washing over her. It wasn't easy, but she was beginning to feel like she had finally taken the first real step toward becoming the person she had always hoped to be. James Walker's decision to take action against discrimination within his airline had a ripple effect far beyond his company. As news of the changes spread, other businesses and industries began to take notice. The media coverage of James's decision to address systemic racism within his airline was widely praised, with many calling it a bold move toward creating a more inclusive and equitable corporate culture. James's policies on diversity, inclusion, and fairness soon became a model for other companies. Organizations across the globe reached out to him for advice on how to implement similar changes. From tech startups to multinational corporations, James's example of leadership inspired a movement for corporate responsibility that was rooted in empathy, equality, and respect. The push for diversity and inclusion didn't just stop with James's airline. It sparked a broader conversation about the role of businesses in shaping societal norms and values. People from all walks of life began demanding better treatment, and companies everywhere realized that the only way to move forward was to ensure that every individual, regardless of their race, gender, or background, felt valued and respected. James, in turn, became a sought-after speaker, often invited to share his story and insights on how businesses could foster inclusive environments. His message was simple but powerful. Fairness and respect weren't just the right things to do, they were the foundation for long-term success. Companies that embraced diversity were not just more equitable, they were more innovative, more productive, and ultimately more profitable. As the years passed, the cultural shift James had ignited became a permanent fixture in corporate life. Discrimination became increasingly rare in industries that had adopted his practices, and inclusivity became a core value for companies across the globe. James's influence wasn't just limited to his airline. It had become a movement that transcended industries and borders. James Walker had never sought fame or recognition, but as he entered retirement, his legacy was cemented in the form of the cultural shift he had inspired. His actions had gone far beyond making his own company better. They had ignited a global movement for equality and fairness. He was humbled by the widespread change, but he never lost sight of what had driven him from the beginning: the belief that even the smallest actions could have a profound impact on the world. James's airline, the company he had once quietly owned, would forever be a symbol of the values he had championed. In honor of his leadership, the airline renamed its training center after him, ensuring that future generations of employees would learn about the importance of empathy, inclusivity, and respect. When James passed away in his late 80s, the outpouring of tributes was immense. CEOs, employees, and everyday people alike honored him for his pioneering work in diversity and inclusion. The airline held a memorial service, and his story was shared as an inspiration for years to come. James's message lived on, not just in his business practices, but in the hearts of people everywhere. He had shown that one person, through compassion, integrity, and unwavering resolve, could change the course of history. His legacy was one of unity and respect, a beacon for all who believed in a better, more just world. James Walker's journey from a quiet billionaire to a powerful force for change serves as a testament to the incredible impact one individual can have when they choose to act with integrity and compassion. His story is a reminder that even in a world filled with prejudice and inequality, a single act of courage can spark a movement that transforms not only companies, but entire industries and societies. By confronting the deep-rooted biases within his own airline and refusing to accept the status quo, James not only set a new standard for corporate responsibility, but also inspired countless others to follow in his footsteps. His approach to leadership, guided by fairness, empathy, and respect, became a model for businesses across the globe, showing that success is not just measured by profits, but by the positive change you bring to the world. As his legacy continued to influence future generations of leaders, James proved that a life well lived is one where you stand up for what is right, even when it's difficult. His story serves as a powerful reminder that we all have the ability to create lasting change, no matter our background or status. When we choose to lead with compassion and fairness, we not only elevate ourselves, but lift others along the way, leaving a world that is more just, inclusive, and kind for those who come after us. James Walker's impact was felt long after his passing. His story, one of humility, courage, and unwavering belief in the power of human connection, continues to inspire people around the world. And as the years pass, the world he helped shape remains a reflection of the legacy of a man who believed that the best way to change the world was by changing the hearts of those who inhabit it. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to James Walker's incredible story. We hope his journey of transformation, leadership, and the power of empathy has inspired you as much as it has inspired us. His story shows us that even the smallest act of courage can lead to monumental change. And it's a reminder that we all have the potential to make a difference in the world. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content like this. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue sharing powerful stories that inspire change and growth. Also, feel free to share this video with others who might benefit from this message. Together, we can spread the values of kindness, empathy, and fairness to make the world a better place. Thanks again for watching, and we look forward to sharing more stories with you soon.